Section 3.4, conditional statements. If P, then Q. That means if P is true, then Q. If you pass the final, then you pass the course. P is passing the final, Q is passing the course. Option 1, you do pass the final and you do pass the course. So if P, then Q was true. P happened and Q happened. Option 2, you pass the final but not the course. So if P, then Q is false. Okay, because if P happens, Q is also supposed to happen. Option 3, you do not pass the final but do pass the course. P does not mention failing the final, so P, then Q is still true because we don't know anything about what happens if P is false. Okay. Option 4, you do not pass the final and do not pass the class. There's no mention of what happens when failing the final, so P, then Q would still be true. Okay, now we're going to have what's called a truth table. Okay, a truth table given different scenarios for P and Q. Okay, so to find out what not Q then P is, first we need to list all the combinations for P and Q. Okay, so they're both true. One is true and the second one's false, or the first one's false, the second one's true, or they're both false. Okay, remember the squiggly means the opposite. Okay, so that opposite of true is false. The opposite of false is true. Okay, now it wants to know if not Q, then not P. Okay, if not Q, then not P is true or false. Okay, so if the first is true and the second is false, then it's false. Okay, if the first is true and the second is false, then it's false. Okay, so let's look at number 1. What's not Q? Not Q is false. So this is the only time that it's false. Okay, we'll say otherwise it is true. Okay, so it's true unless the first is true, the second is false. Okay, so let's look at number 2. Number 2. We're using not Q. What's not Q? True. What's not P? False. So the first is true, the second is false, so number 2 is false. Okay, so number 2 is the only thing that has the first is true, second is false, because we're saying the first thing is the not Q. Okay, on number 3, not Q is false. Okay, so that's not going to satisfy that thing at the bottom. What about number 4? The first is true, the second is true, so it's true. The only time this is false, okay, the only time this is false is when the first thing is true, the second thing is false. So the first thing is that not Q is true, the not P is false. Okay, some more of those. P, true. Q, true. That means not Q is false. Okay. P is true, not Q is false. Okay, so the first thing is true. The second thing is false. That makes it false. Okay, the rule is always if the first is true and the second is false, then it's false. Okay, let me number these like I did on that first one. Okay, number one, they're both false. So not P means true. Okay, so what is Q, then not P? Okay, so Q is the first thing we're looking for. Not P is the second thing we're looking for. Okay. So the first thing is false, so that means it's automatically true. On line number 2, the first thing is false, so that means it's automatically true. On number 3, the first thing is true, the second thing is true, so it's still true. Okay. When does it come out false? When the first thing is true and the second thing is false. Okay, we've got the first thing is true and the second thing is false. That's when this is false. Okay. If the first thing's true, the second thing's false, it's false. That's the only time it's false. Okay, let's go back to these. Okay, if the first is true and the second is false, this is the first thing and this is the second thing. Okay, so we do have true false there, so that makes it false. Okay, let me go back and change that color here, because that's probably not going to print well for anybody that wants to print. Okay, so what's our first thing here? Our first thing is not Q. Okay, so because we're looking at this not Q, then P. Okay, so this is our second thing. Okay, so what's the only time we have true for the first and false for the second? Okay, this is where we have true for the first and false for the second. Okay, the first thing is true, the second thing is false. That's what leads to this being false. Okay, and that's the end of the section.